Okay, we're recording. Oh, your audio's out again.
How about now?
Yes, now we got it.
Okay. We'll go ahead and call this meeting to order. I guess in terms of it's a meeting in which it's our board retreat, and we have all in attendance of our board directors and guests Amy Cass, Eileen Yashina, and Matthew Gulbranson. I hope I did okay on that. All right, and I'll go ahead and let our folks take it away.
Okay, are we ready we're just getting started? Jumping right in? Okay, fantastic. Good morning, everybody.
Before we go, can we get the approval? We kind of have this approval of the agenda since it is a board meeting. We have to kind of go through that. We did the welcome of guests, but I'm wondering, we have to do that approval of the agenda and then move on.
I move we approve the agenda.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All right, we'll go ahead and move along to discussion items. And now we'll go ahead and let our guests run the thing.
Good morning, everybody. Good to see you all. Carly, nice to meet you. I'm Eileen Yoshina. I use she and her pronouns, and I am a Director of Equity and Education at Puget Sound ESD. And so we've been I'm saying this mostly to get to know Carly a little bit, but we have been working with Tukwila School District for a couple of years now, and really happy to be doing this work with the board especially, and really excited about the work that the board is engaging in to really strengthen their use of a racial equity lens in doing their work together collaboratively, and we're just really happy to be back. So just a few things about what the portion of today that Matthew and I are going to be presenting. For a lot of you, you will have seen this before in some way, shape, or form. And so I think when we talked about planning, we talked about, even though you have seen these things before, they're easy to talk about and they're hard to practice. And so we really wanted to bring them back to have this discussion to see how more deeply we can dive into them. And then from there, we did some planning with Amy, and then from there, Amy's going to help you really work on some ways of using these concepts that we talk about to do the work that you need to do. So as Matthew and I are talking, you can think about, we've talked a lot on this in this group about the why we want to do this. Why is it important for us to lead in this way, to lead with racial equity, to lead authentically in collaboration with our partners? And I think this session might be a little bit more, and Matthew, you can tell me if this is accurate, about the how. Like, how do we do that? Like, what are the values that we hold in place as we put those things into practice? Does that sound okay, Matthew? Okay, awesome. Great. So we will go ahead and get started then. And Matthew, are you sharing right now?
No, I think Flip, are you sharing? Yeah, Flip sharing.
Okay.
That's me sharing. I can give screen sharing.
Okay, and I think Matthew's got our slides, so.
Great. Let's see.
We will come back to this though, Flip, so.
Great.
Yeah.
I'm giving it to everybody.
Great.
So, okay, you should be able to share now.
Okay. Okay, here we go.
All right, fantastic. So one of the things that we always try to start with, and anything that we do, as we've mentioned many times in the past, Puget Sound ESD, our mission is to eliminate the opportunity gap and success for each child by leading with racial equity. And so one of our practices as we try to work towards that goal and to live into those values is to start our meetings by honoring Native land and Indigenous people. So we've done this with you all before. We won't spend a lot of time on this, but honoring Native land and Indigenous people is not just that moment of reading a land acknowledgement, but it's also a moment of reflecting on what does that actually mean? What does it mean to be on Native land? What does it mean to be to not allow ourselves to be complicit in the erasure of Indigenous people? What's our role and responsibility, especially as educators, to bring this kind of knowledge? You can see some of those questions on the screen there, to really reflect on, as people who are supporting the education system, how much knowledge do our students have about the land that they are on and the people who have been on this land since time immemorial in this school district? And what's our role and our responsibility as adults in the community and as educators to really ensure that our students know whose land this is, and also are people who are true partners and allies and co-conspirators in solidarity with Native people and who do not participate in the erasure of Indigenous people. So part of that is knowing and being in relationship and being in partnership with our Native communities. We're going to talk more about partnership in general as we move through today, but just kind of holding that as one of our important relationships and one of our important partners. Bridget, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yes, please. I just want to honor the Duwamish, the Muckleshoot, and our Coast Salish tribes. And also today marks the day that the Treaty of Point Elliott was signed, in which Chief Seattle was the first to sign out of reverence as such an important chief. And so just kind of want to honor that. And also the Duwamish tribe is having a community meeting today, and it's called the State of the Tribe is going to happen today. And so just kind of want to just bring them into this space and honor our tribes, and also acknowledge that the Treaty of Point Elliott did not follow through, still has not followed through for all our tribes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much. I so appreciate that, Bridget. And yeah, just important for us to know about those treaties and what our responsibilities are and our relationships, how they govern our relationships with our tribal community. So thank you so much for bringing that resource to us. Okay. Oh, okay. Matthew, do you want to chat?
Yeah, I'll do this one real quick.
Great.
So this work is centered in relationships and partnerships and building trust. And so I just wanted to bring this continuum of partnerships back, just to highlight that this work lives in the space of collaboration and integrated partnerships, where we're building together, right? We're in the sandbox. We are in deep collaboration, thinking about sharing our thoughts, who we are as people, creating things together. And just to be aware of, typically in institutions, the status quo is kind of on that left side of the continuum, which tends to be more kind of transactional based, right? It tends to be more performative, transactional. I'll give you this if you give me that, and very kind of surface level. So just this thinking about what does deep collaboration look like? What does sharing ourselves and sharing power and building relationships and trust in this process look like and feel like? And that it doesn't feel like what's normal. And that is how we, we move together. We move slower, but we move deeper. Okay.
Okay, we wanted to quickly go over these definitions just to make sure that we are all on the same page and have the same language as we're talking about what does it mean to look at the manifestations of racism within institutions and within systems. so that we can think about and be intentional about the ways that we want to transform those systems so that they're not perpetuating racism. So I just was watching a video with Ibram X. Kendi the other day, who is the author of Stamped from the Beginning. Some you probably have heard of that work. And he was talking, somebody asked him, you know, there's this debate about critical race theory in a lot of our school districts, right? And maybe that's come before you as well. And one of the things that he said is that he thinks one of the root causes of the conflict is that we are not talking about the same thing when we're talking about race. So he said, I would ask people who are troubled by what they perceive as critical race theory, what do they mean by racism? And I think a lot of our conversation, our disagreements, our misunderstandings of one another happen because we don't have the same shared definitions. So one of us might be talking about structural or institutional racism, and another person might be really focused on individual racism. We just wanted to spend some time reorienting ourselves to those definitions so that we're using the same language and we have shared understanding. And so we're just going over what we are calling the levels of racism. So individual racism is what a lot of people think of when they think about racism. And so that's intentional prejudgment, bias, or discrimination by an individual based on race. So that's people who have biases against other people and act on those biases, either intentionally or unintentionally, but those are individual acts, right? And so that is something that happens. That is something we see happen all the time. That's something that the media tends to focus on, right? So if you see news coverage of a school district, for example, where there was racism, it's a lot of times it's focusing in on the actions of an individual, whether it's a student who did something or a teacher who did something. It's the actions of an individual, and those stories, that kind of story tends to get a lot of attention. Those are things that really capture people's attention. And I would say the reason why those things capture attention is because a lot of us feel like we can look at that person who committed that act and say, oh, that's a bad person, right? Or that person did a bad thing, and it's not me. The rest of us are kind of off the hook because we didn't do that thing, right? So if we do something to that person, if we give that person a consequence, then we've done our job. So that's probably the most common way that a lot of folks in the community understand racism. And so what we want to do is make sure that we understand racism on multiple levels, on many deeper levels. So the next type of racism we want to talk about is institutional racism, which looks a lot differently than individual racism. So institutional racism are the policies, practices, and procedures that work to the benefit of white people and the detriment of people of color, often unintentionally or inadvertently. So what are some things that stand out to you about that definition of racism? What are some words in that definition that just jump out at you? Practices and procedures.
Built into the day-to-day of how we do business.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I like that. Built into the day-to-day of how we do business. Yep. Thank you, Bridget.
I think on a national level, you see a lot of that currently in a lot of the restructuring of voting procedures or practices in states. That's a huge issue right now. That's I think in the national conversation, centering a lot of this around how institutional that is. How in the past they talked about the structural racism, the whole reason why the Voting Rights Act was put in place, but that this re-injection of making it harder, meaning practices or procedures for something to happen specifically targeted towards people of color.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are great examples of both institutional and structural racism, of voting rights laws that we see getting passed in some places, right? Dismantling the Voting Rights Act, the impacts of the Voting Rights Act are having the impact of disproportionately disadvantaging people of color, right? And at the same time, consolidating power in white communities. So that is a clear example to me of institutional racism. The other thing I want to point out in that definition are those words often unintentionally or inadvertently. So I think there's this sort of plausible deniability thing happening in the case of the Voting Rights Act as well. Just to bring that example in, where people are saying, Mitch McConnell was on the news the other day. Some of you may have seen that, talking about there's nothing to worry about. Well, one thing that he talked about was Black Americans are voting at the same rate as Americans, right? Thereby implying that Black African Americans are not like Americans. But also there's this thing happening where it's like, oh, it's nothing to worry about. The intention is not to disenfranchise African American people. Therefore, this is not institutionalized racism. And what we want to bring to mind is that we need to look at impact and not intention, right? I think there's a lot of ways in which people can say our intention wasn't to do this thing, and yet the impact is that it's a negative impact collectively on Black communities in these areas. And so therefore, we can look at it as a manifestation as institutionalized racism. And I see there's a comment. Let's see the chat. Yeah, how we interpret and implement policies, how we develop policies in ways that continue to reinforce systemic dominant power. Yeah, absolutely. Can anyone think of any other policies, practices, and procedures that work to the benefit of white people and the detriment of people of color, even if it's unintentional? Maybe think about things in the school district, in the school system. What are some of those policies, practices, and procedures?
The fact that just as an institution, education institutions are centered around English.
Yeah. And again, that's an intent impact thing, right? The intention is not necessarily to exclude people or to intentionally disadvantage people, and yet that's its impact, right?
I'm thinking about there was a policy, sexual harassment policy that came our way, and it was written in gender binary. And we know that trans and queer folks experience sexual harassment and sexual assault in I can't even think how many times, but just that's an example where we kind of went through that policy and passed it. And I'm not even sure who from our community was brought in to make sure that we are meeting the needs of all our community members.
Yeah, that's a great example, and probably one we can come back to when we talk about partnerships as well. Like, who is at the table when we're making decisions is a big part of this conversation. So thank you. Yeah.
Another area that always comes to mind for me is the whole funding system. So we have in the state a pretty inequitable funding system. It's in a lot of ways, it's provides the same resources to everybody regardless of need. And so that just kind of embeds the inequities that are in the system in general and just continues them. So.
Absolutely. And it has the impact, right? Like, looking at impact, it has the impact of continually uplifting white communities typically and disinvesting in communities of color. Yeah, thank you. Okay, and then The other level we want to just talk about quickly here is structural racism. And Dr. Herndon alluded to this, but structural racism is a history and current reality of institutional racism across all institutions. This combines to create a system that negatively impacts communities of color. So if we look at the Voting Rights Act that's being passed right now, we can see that this voting rights in this country have had a long history of institutionalized racism behind them, right? So it's looking historically about how racism has been used to include or exclude certain people from participating in American democracy. And that's structural racism. It's like looking at the ways in which historically racism has been embedded into many of the laws of our country. And that was very explicit and very clear at times in our country's history. And so, you know, it's to say that we need to have a lens around racism and structural racism when we're looking at trying to create more equity in our systems. We won't get there by pretending that that was not a factor, right? It's very explicit in our country's history that race has been a factor in who can vote and who can't vote. And so having a race conscious solution is really necessary to address those problems that are deeply embedded in our country's laws. Anybody have any thoughts or questions about that piece?
Well, the other one that comes to mind, you know, is wealth accumulation and redlining and, you know, Tulsa and, you know, an endless list of things that have been done in the past that have cut people off from accumulating wealth.
Yeah, absolutely. And that has direct impact on our schools, right? Our communities that we live in, where people live, redlining, where redlining came from, the fact that the federal government was complicit in redlining and in housing loans and who could have access to loans, who could live in certain places, who wouldn't, who could borrow money, who couldn't. All of those things, right, are part of the history of structural racism in this country.
I think even to the point that Director Apoa Ryder highlighted at the very beginning, a lot of the not following through with the Treaty of Point Elliott, excluding Native Americans from the city limits of Seattle, and then just the whole reservation system of saying this is where you get to live. Obviously impactful to this day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely, right. And where you get to live is just a tiny fraction of traditional homelands of our indigenous people, right? And often the least resourced places, like the least desirable. You know, they used to have city of Seattle's traditional homeland of the Duwamish tribe. And then they were literally excluded from the city limits of Seattle and do not even have federal recognition at this time. Many Duwamish tribe became part of what is now known as Muckleshoot, or descendants of Duwamish people became now part of the federally recognized Muckleshoot tribe. And the Muckleshoot tribe was created by that treaty, and again has this really interesting checkerboard thing happening where it's not even one sort of consistent area of land, right? There's places that are tribal lands right next to places that are privately owned or owned by the state of Washington. So it continues to have impact on our tribal communities. All right, thank you. Then Matthew, you want to scoot to the next one? Okay, and then Matthew, did you want to talk about this one, or is it still me?
Go for it. Yeah.
Okay. So the last one we want to talk about, we sent you the article to look at, and hopefully you had a chance to look that over. And for most of you, that is a review of something we've talked about before. But this last level of racism is really just becomes part of the culture of how we live. And as Matthew always often says, it's the air that we breathe. And that's what we call white supremacy. And so those words often, create that reaction in people who, when we hear white supremacy, we think, right, KKK, or we think the Aryan Nation or groups like that. And those are absolutely, those terror groups are part of the manifestation of white supremacy. And that's just the most extreme manifestation. So this definition of white supremacy is much more subversive and much more widespread. And it just becomes the way that things are normed around how we've made whiteness normal in this country. And just gets into our definitions and our values around what we consider a good student, a good person, a decent community member, what it means to be smart, what it means to be beautiful, what it means to be good. Those ideals are often in this country normed around whiteness, right? So I'll just read you this definition. So white supremacy is what we center as normal, standard, and good. The idea or ideology that white people and the ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions of white people are superior to people of color and their ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions. White supremacy is ever present in our institutional and cultural assumptions that assign value, morality, goodness, and humanity to the white group, while casting people and communities of color as worthless, immoral, bad, inhuman, and undeserving. Drawing from critical race theory, the term white supremacy also refers to a political or socioeconomic system where white people enjoy structural advantage and rights that other racial and ethnic groups do not, both at a collective and an individual level. It's a racist ideology based upon the belief that white people are superior in many ways to people of other races, which is embedded in our history and omissions of history, systems, institutions, beliefs, and values. So as an example of that, we can have conversations about, like, one of the things I do in my job is I work with our educators of color. And if I talk to that group and I say, and you can even try this yourselves, but if you were to just quickly pull up Google and Google good teacher or good leader, you would notice a theme, right? You would probably see, you can try it and see, just do a Google image search of good leader and see what you find out, or good professional and see what you find out. One of the things I often talk to the educators of color about is this idea of professionalism, and ask them, what does it mean to be a professional, right? And if you hear what people describe as professionalism, it is very much normed around whiteness, right? And so our educators of color have sometimes been told that they're being unprofessional if they're speaking their native language, if they're not speaking English, if they wear their hair in a way that's more ethnically authentic to their cultural heritage, if they wear clothing that's more representative of their ethnic cultural heritage than it is of, say, like white business institutional culture in America. So those are some examples of ways in which white supremacy becomes normalized in our culture and just a part of our cultural values and the way we live our lives, right? Matthew, do you want to add anything to that?
No, it'll all be folded in here. I think one analogy that I really love of these levels is thinking about the individual level as a tree, the institutional level as like a mountain or a hill, and then the structural level being like a whole mountain range. So the connection of all of those institutions. And then this level of white supremacy being the soil. So it's like covers everything. And we're all rooted in it in some way. It's just a question of figuring out what that looks like for us, both individually and as a collective.
So in the past, we've had some conversations about, like, how does that show up in our school systems? And just thinking to yourselves, like, what do we consider a good student to be, right? What do we consider academic success to look like? What do we consider a good teacher to be, right? Thinking about those things and thinking about how they're tied into often values that are normed around whiteness. And just becoming more aware of that is something that's going to help us transform that and help us do things differently so that we can have a broader definition, a more inclusive definition of what it means to be a smart kid and a good teacher. and a good educator and a good community member and a good family, a loving family, all of those things, right, as we move forward. Yes, Flip.
So it's really interesting. I did those two searches, Google searches that you were suggesting. And when I did the good teacher, great teacher is what I put in, my the images that came up were actually kind of diverse, pretty diverse, which was, interesting. But I just did it for great student and it was totally different. Like almost all the images were of Caucasian students. And I found that quite interesting. To do the exercise, I just thought it was really interesting.
Yeah. Award-winning teacher, teacher mentor, professor, right?
It's interesting. I just was reading a book called Science in the City, and they talk about this idea that a lot of the science classes, there's a lot of vocabulary in there about how science is taught and so forth. And, for a lot of students of color, they may not use that particular vocabulary, but the concepts, they know the concepts and they can articulate it in language that they're familiar with. And so the challenge in the science classes is to kind of bring those two together in a way that's going to bring up the students who they understand the concepts because they see it in their daily lives, and they may not use the exact science words, but they understand it. So anyway, that whole dynamic was really interesting. It was explored in this book.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great example. And I had the awesome experience of taking the Native Education Certificate program through University of Washington. Taught by Megan Bang and colleagues at the University of Washington. And one of the focuses of Dr. Bang's research is on how math and science and what we might consider STEM concepts are really very indigenous knowledge. It's how people live in and understand the world that they live in. And indigenous people, to live and thrive in their environment, had to have deep understanding of science, technology, engineering, math, right? But those are not the ways in which it's not the same way that it looks in European studies of those same fields. And so this course was really fascinating and all about the ways in which, like, if we look at the wisdom, the traditional inherent wisdom of Native communities and indigenous communities, there's incredibly complex understandings of all of those kinds of concepts, scientific concepts, all of the above, the STEM concepts, and indigenous communities pre-contact, of course, they had to be really good at understanding and living in their natural environment, right? And so honoring that kind of wisdom is actually like, if let me just say it this way, if we don't honor that kind of wisdom, and our schools often don't honor Native and indigenous wisdom, we're missing out on an incredibly rich source of understanding and a different kind of understanding of STEM concepts and education and wisdom, right? So I think that's just one way of thinking about that as well, too. Right? It's like my friend Suilan Ho'okano is Native Hawaiian woman, and she often says, we were science before science was called science. So I've always kind of held on to that idea as well.
I recently read Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States, and I was just stunned by them talking about the pathways, oh my gosh, the systems of roads and pathways that they created, right? That were just so, like, I don't know, beyond what white settler stuff that they could ever do, right? It was just really remarkable. So just those things that you were talking about,
Yeah, that's awesome. That's a great example. Thank you. I grew up in Hawaii myself, and one of the things that I learned about growing up was that the descendants of Native Hawaiian people now came from Polynesia, and they made that voyage from the Tahiti area in canoes that they built and navigated across the Pacific Ocean without, navigational equipment, that things that we might recognize today as navigational equipment. They used the stars and they read the waves and they understood weather patterns, right? So thinking about like this an incredible amount of STEM knowledge that is, I for sure did not learn that in science class growing up in and going to school in Hawaii public schools, right? I think I learned about it, but did not learn science in that way. And I do feel like that maybe that would have been, if I had learned science by going out on a canoe and paddling and doing some of those things, maybe I would have been better at science because it had application to the world I was living in. So just thinking about like whose wisdom is being taught in schools. I think it goes along besides just science and STEM classes, whose history is being taught, whose knowledge is considered important, whose stories are being taught. We consider whose language is being taught. In Hawaii now, because of the work of Native Hawaiian educators, students are learning Hawaiian, right? And there's now fluent Hawaiian speakers in Hawaii after decades of, investment in teaching Hawaiian language. I always wonder, like, what would it look like if we had Lashutsi taught in our public schools in the same way that kids in Hawaii have access to learning Hawaiian? So just those are some of the ways I think we can think about how these concepts have application to our education system. Thank you.
Okay, so thinking about those levels, our work really becomes like, if we use this analogy of us as trees and rooted in our relationship to white supremacy and racism in this country, and in ourselves, the work then becomes about, it's our mirror work, right? The difference between mirror work and window work, that oftentimes with these issues, we can look out the window and point the finger and says, well, if only like all of this would change, then we wouldn't have a problem anymore. But the problem is we don't have control over those things being changed. So our locus of control, what we can really change is ourselves and how we show up. In relationship to each other, how we show up in our institutions, and really looking at what is it to what is that relationship to white supremacy being the soil that we're rooted in? How does that show up in me? How am I complicit in perpetuating the cycles of institutional racism? And that's hard work, right? I like to think of it as root work rather than leaf work, right? So we can think about the leaves at the end of our branches, and it's easy to think that's the problem. But thinking about this system, like what's happening with our leaves is what's happening with our roots, right? So it becomes a process of digging into ourselves and thinking about, what does that look like? What does that sound like? What does that feel like? And how am I complaining about the very thing that I want to change, right? So that's tough. That's a tough ask. It's a tough thing to practice. It's a tough thing to be in that kind of a relationship with ourselves and with each other. But it's so crucial in terms of how we move forward and how we change that culture of white supremacy, and how we change that relationship to what's showing up within ourselves in our institutions. And then there's this collective aspect, right? That we don't live, we're not a tree by ourselves, on top of a mountain, right? Like we are in an ecosystem. We are in relationship with each other. And there's this analogy by Adrienne Marie Brown in her book Emergent Strategies of the oldest trees to survive Hurricane Katrina were these old oak groves. And the reason they survived is because their root systems are connected to each other, right? So they held each other in place when the storm was raging. And I feel like that's just such a great analogy to this work, because because it's going to get hard. There's going to be storms that come all the time, whether that's media attention, whether that's some individual doing some racist thing that gets, that gets blown up in the media. Changing our status quo is always going to get heat. I think, when we see the reaction to any kind of disruption of the status quo, we get the backlash, right? If we think about the backlash of CRT, in education, so many different examples of that. So what does that ecosystem look like to each other? And if we're doing this work as a collective with a sense of purpose and direction, that's super, super powerful. Yeah, thank you, Bridget. Especially right now with COVID response in the community. Yep. So just this idea of, doing our own individual mirror work, but then also doing that as a collective, in a space, in a relationship with other folks. And this work is heart work, right? It's important to understand it intellectually and to know the words and to have that common analysis. But really, this is our sense of being. This is like how we are. This is how we show up every day. It's how we show up to the grocery store, right? It's how we greet each other in the morning when we say hello. It's so many different things. It's how we react when things get really tough in a meeting, and gritty. And what is our relationship with that? What is our response to that? How are we engaging with our own discomfort in that? So it lives in our whole body, right? It's not just in our head. And it's how we walk through each day. So this work, looking at the partnership framework, is disrupting the status quo. So all of the things that Eileen talked about with the levels, with our history and our relationship to racism and how this country was founded and how it was built and how this is woven into our history, our institutions, so in so many different ways. It's like a fabric, right? It's like this woven fabric of white supremacy. And this status quo is what keeps us stuck. And that lives in the institution, and it also lives within ourselves, right? And if we're talking about changing culture, if we're talking about changing our institutions and how we perpetuate this problem, the deepest part of that change work is ourselves. Like, we can change a policy, we can change a practice, we can invite community in to help us make decisions on things. But if we're showing up in a way that is still centering white supremacy, that keeps us stuck in those ways of being, we won't be able to change that thing, right? We won't be able to get different outcomes if we're showing up in the same way that we've always shown up. So this, the transformational framework is really based out of that premise. It's based out of the deepest level of work, doing work around racism is disrupting it within ourselves, disrupting it in our partnerships, disrupting it as a part of how we show up together in relationship to each other, right? In that deep collaborative space. And it's messy, it's hard. There's no one right way to do it. And I know you've seen this before. So what we wanted to do today was think about what are those ways of being, thinking about this, the inside of this circle being the ways that we get stuck, that we perpetuate the status quo, that we oftentimes, want to use as a solution to the status quo. We see that happening a lot. When we say like either or thinking, we want to combat white supremacy by using the same premises and ideas and ways of being that perpetuate white supremacy, right? So it's easy to get stuck in that. So how do we practice? Where do we go from there? First we have to notice what those things are, right? We have to notice the inner circle and notice how we do that. But then once we do that, then we have a choice to change into something different. So that's the transformational work. That's the transformational work in ourselves. That's it, the transformational work with each other. That's how we're showing up when we're inviting folks in to do partnership work together and share power and make decisions and do collaboration. Those are how we can build our practices. That's how we can build our culture, like and shift and like. And if I'm thinking like, I'm not too much of a gardener. My mom and my brother are both like really green thumbs and do amazing gardening work. And their whole thing is like the work is in the soil. Like that's the most important piece. Like if your soil is off balance, if it needs more minerals, if it needs this, if it needs that, that's a lot of what they do. It's all about the soil. So how do we change our soil, right? If that's our status quo and what we're rooted in, it's, you know, let's change how we're being fed. So we need to identify those things. So that's what we're going to do today, is to dive into those aspects of transformation and liberation and possibility and healing. And how do we want to practice that? How do we want to practice that ourselves and with each other? So we want to take a few minutes just to do some self-reflective work. Like maybe like, let's say like a minute and a half ish, and think about which aspects of these of transformation do you want to practice, like as a person. And then what we're going to do is do some thinking about what ways of transformation and partnership do we want to practice as a board. So this is going to be now me and Eileen are done talking. So now it's going to be all y'all's work to dig into that. So let's take like a minute and a half, do some reflection on which one of these feels most important for you to work on. And it could be more than one. And then we'll have a conversation as a collective of which one of these do we want to bring in and practice as a group. Does that make sense? Go 30 more seconds. Okay. So our question, given that you've identified a piece or two to take on, is which one of these aspects will you practice as a board? And define what that will look like, sound like, and feel like. So maybe we can share back to start with, what did you choose for you? And then we'll have the discussion of what that what that can look like as a board, and hopefully land on 1, 2, 3 of these to practice. Anybody want to share what they chose?
Happy to share. For myself, I chose perfectionism and sense of urgency. Those are two things that I've been aware of for a while, and I think, yeah. So it's been a journey process already, but a long way to go, I think, and yeah, really getting to the other side of, yeah, not living in that as much.
Thank you, Carly.
So the two I had were collaboration and inclusiveness, kind of two sides of the same coin, but
Great. Thank you, Dave.
I think the two that I look at that I think help transcend a lot of the other ones are the right to comfort and defensiveness, because I think if you can kind of start to deal, I think those two are pretty closely related. Like if you don't feel comfortable, I think people get pretty defensive, and then that makes it difficult to do a couple of the other ones. So I see those two as pretty closely related. And if you can kind of get okay with that, I think it opens a lot of the other avenues on the wheel.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, Flip. Edna, Jan, what you thinking?
Well, for me, as you all well know, avoiding conflict and collaboration would be.
Thank you, Edna.
For me, I put, I think power hoarding, power sharing is something that I think we need to be really aware of. And also, well, the welcoming discomfort, right to comfort. I like to think about applying that to not only me and not only, but yeah, never mind. That one is important.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Jen. Bridget, any thoughts? You're muted. Muted.
I'll stick with valuing
You cut out. Still can't hear you.
Here we go. Am I back?
Yes.
Okay. Valuing difference and power sharing. And the keyword in valuing difference is value. And to really recognize that there's many truths, and that oftentimes like I have to check my internal white supremacy to like shut things down, or if something's so hard to hear, it's and so like that's one. And then the power sharing, and I just was thinking about like in my doctoral training in educational leadership, we learned different frames, and one type of leadership frame is political. And that's one more now, and I was so turned off by it. Like I hated it when I first learned it, but now like everything is political. It's all about power dynamics and what that looks like. And so that power sharing is a powerful one for me right now, to learn and to think in terms of that.
Great, thank you, Bridget. I think too, like this next conversation about which ones do you want to focus on as a board, is Bridget, when you said like they're all interconnected, You know, like it's like one big giant knot, right? Or web. Like if you're tugging on one, it's gonna tug on the others. So the beauty of it is it doesn't matter which one you start with, because you're gonna start with that one, and then you're gonna get to another one, and then get to another one, and get to another one, right? So it's very, very much both and. So to not get in that thing of like, well, you know, we need to focus on this, because if we don't focus on this, then we're not going to do this. And, you know, it's easy to get kind of stuck in a finite either or way of thinking about where to go. And honestly, you could like close your eyes and throw a dart at the wall, and it's all going to be good, right? Because it's about doing the unweaving, like getting the knot undone. So I would just open this up to like, if you as a board were to pick 1, 2, or 3 or whatever, how many of these you want to kind of hold in front of you as a way of practicing together, what would those be? I mean, I did hear power hoarding as one that came up for several of you. So I'll throw that out there to start, but just kind of wanted to open it up to you to have a discussion about and rumble play with which ones do you think would be most important to practice? And there's no wrong answers.
The few that I wrote down that came to mind initially, and other people have spoken to already, the fear of open conflict, right to comfort, and then worship of the written word.
I'm sorry, Carly, I didn't hear your last one.
Worship of the written word.
Yeah, it seems to me like, you know, power sharing and collaboration, inclusiveness, all those are closely related. I mean, they're two sides of the same coin. So that whole area.
I agree. Those are the most important ones for me.
Can I confirm something? Curious. Just want to make sure that I'm like, so we're thinking about the transformational work that we want to do as a board, not necessarily it's the end goal is the transformational work that we want to do as a board in the community as well. So like when we think about power hoarding, are we thinking about power hoarding within the board? Or are we thinking about power hoarding as a board from the community?
Yeah, it's very much a both and.
There's that either or thinking coming in. Thank you.
Because that's the question first, is how are you going to practice that as a board? And then the next question is how will you extend those practices in the community, right? So yeah, go ahead, Bridget.
I guess I'm just sort of sitting and thinking about the community right now, and kind of like thinking about like if there have been harmed or if people have been made to feel disempowered or ignored. And so how can we respond to that, right? Like what would be the response? So that's what I'd like to just sort of bring into the space, is kind of just maybe holding some of those, because we all are out in the community listening and aware of things both present and historically. And so maybe I mean, that's kind of what I'm thinking of, is maybe thinking about, you know, how we, like what Reverend Bowler Jack has said in the past about how we do our work. You know, how can we improve our partnerships and healing with our community?
Yeah. And then so like that, yeah, I think keeping that in the center is good. And then also knowing that you'll have to practice that yourself and as a board before you can practice that with the community, right? So it's a part of that continuum. But you all have to, will have to do that within this space in order to do that with your community. Does that make sense?
I just wanted to interject as well that your modeling of those practices is really powerful, right? So a lot of times a lot of us don't know what that looks like. And so if you can really even talk about it in a really intentional and explicit way as you're doing it, and even name that you're doing it, I think that's a really powerful signal to your community that this is important to you, and that this is what you're working on. And you won't have to be perfect at it. And I think that you just naming it and saying, oh, we've made an agreement that we're going to practice this, shows your intentions to the community, right? So I think there's a lot of power in making that practice public.
Because really what we're doing by changing the soil is creating a world that is, I would say, free or mostly free from white supremacy and racism. And what does that look like? We don't know, because we've never lived in that place before, right? And like the reaction of that, I think a lot of times is it gets stuck in the either or, like either you're doing it, or you're not. Like either there's racism or not. Like, and we've seen that pop up, at the ESD, is like, we're on a journey to get there, but that doesn't mean that we've eliminated racism within our agency, within our institution, or within education, right? Like that's still going to be there, but we have to practice that first if we're going to be able to get there. So just that reaction a lot of times that comes from the either or, we'll see that show up. Like if you're Bridget, if you're thinking of like saying like, this is what we're practicing, then the response is going to be, well, you haven't done it because this is still happening, right? So that a lot of times that response can be from that either or place. It's just that we can't respond in the either or. Otherwise, then we're right back. We're stuck again.
I think the other piece that we've been trying to do, at least I've been trying to stress it as well, is that I think the ultimate goal is to put in enough of the expectations and practices that they sustain beyond any individual, right? Elections happen, board members come in, principals come in, superintendents come in, like there's always turnover. But if it's sustained enough throughout the organization, it is a system-wide practice, and it lives beyond any one individual.
Yep, exactly. Okay, so I heard right to comfort. I heard power sharing, and I heard like collaboration and inclusiveness as a few that were, I feel like, rose to the top. Am I missing any that folks heard that was a connection between?
The more I think about the situation we're in, where communication has been one of our maybe weaknesses, the worship of the written word seems to keep popping up. We keep trying to translate things and expect that's going to be the answer. And I think maybe we need to look at that as how communication really works. So that's, to me, that would be an important one.
Okay, great. You can add that. You can add them all.
I know, I was just gonna say, it's really hard to choose because I'm like, but this one would look good, and this one needs to, because defensiveness, I think, is coming up too, and just thinking about, like, we need to move towards responsiveness, and I think that's both internally as a board and as externally, so that one was really jumping out to me too.
Yeah. So the next steps would be thinking about how will you practice that, right? If we're naming these like areas that we want to lean into, what will that actually look like in practice?
So I think a lot of what we do, or some of what we do as a board, is you know, things come before us and we're asked to approve things. And so we've been, I think, moving in the direction with the racial equity toolkit and the emphasis on kind of when we're asked to approve something, okay, has there been input from the community? Has there been input from the students, and what is it? And, you know, how is that? I mean, typically we get kind of recommendations from the staff. And so, you know, kind of examining, and recently we had I think a technology plan that came forward, and the question was, well, how have you gotten input from the community on that? And we said, and you know, there hadn't been sufficient amount of that, so it got sent back, and so they're working on that. So I mean, in terms of yeah, collaboration and power sharing, I mean, we want to make sure that you know, these voices of all the different community members are heard and understood before we start making decisions.
That sounds good.
Along those lines, right now, the way the structures are in place is we're asking, you know, through Dr. Herndon's leadership for his executive team to go out and do that kind of work. And one of the things that is happening like in other districts that I think is really cool is they actually have like a racial equity council or wisdom table in which that there would be some power sharing there with the board in collaboration with the board. So it's another way to bring in even more voices. It's also like more structural change in terms of kind of versus what we have now. And of course, nothing is perfect, but it's more opportunities. And I think it was Shoreline, the equity officer, executive officer for that district was talking about when they set up their council, it was 80% community members, parents, students, and then like 20% staff. So that was kind of how they set it up. And I thought that was important, like in thinking about how we do it and whose voices we're listening to. So that it's along the lines of sort of like not only how is our other people in the district, are we asking them to do it, but how are we doing it too?
Yep. Yep. Then I also want to point out, like, so far the conversation is like, what does this look like out here, right? But like that focus, that keeping that focus as much as you can, like on the personal, and then on your relationships to each other as a board. Because if you don't have that, it's going to be a lot harder to practice what it looks like in relationship to the community. And there might be different ones that you practice as a board and with your relationship to the community than you practice with yourself, right? Like as a collective here.
I gotcha.
Does that make sense?
Yeah,
and it's all good.
Yeah, I'll kick that one off. And so like, yeah, so I'll just share with you. So one of the things I'm working on personally is despite racialized trauma, racialized battle fatigue, trauma, and harm and hurt, I am dedicated to developing healthy relationships with each you know, our group, our team together. And so that's something that's in my heart and I'm going to work and strive towards. And at the same time, be unapologetic if I need to bring my whole self, or like, and that's the other aspect of it, because that honors who I am and my, you know, my ancestors and my people as well. So I'm going to do my best to build relationship and trust and then at the same time also be unapologetic at times as well.
Great, thank you, Bridget.
And I just wanted to add the reflection that, you know, being unapologetic can be done with great love and compassion. So I just wanted to add that additional layer, right? Is that it's also a way of reframing what we see as, you know, I think sometimes we can, sometimes when people of color speak their truth, a very common thing that happens is that they get pinned as sort of like rocking the boat, being the troublemaker, being angry. You know, I've heard words like aggressive, angry, all those kinds of things, right? So to say that we can reframe our definition of what loving communication looks like and honor and value honesty and speaking your truth as a form of that kind of loving communication as well.
The things that I think I've mentioned at a different time to Bridget, and it kind of goes in the realm of power holding, is what would it look like if, you know, we leaned into the strengths of each individual board member, and, you know, had projects or committee task force or, you know, wisdom tables, right, that each individual board member was supporting and leading based on their strengths. And then coming, you know, and then using that as a way to share power and share, again, skill and strength and yeah.
Yeah, I think we've talked about that quite a bit. The subcommittee, that's something that's this board has never done very much of, and I think that'd be a really good. We need to find, you know, the particular topics to do that with, but I think there's a lot of good potential for yeah, sharing power, getting more voices involved, yeah, all of that. And I'd love that to apply. I mean, I'm the legislative rep, so I'd love that to apply to anything legislative that I'm working on, because I'm working on a bunch of stuff, and the more the merrier, I always say on that subject. So it's great. I've sometimes over the years I've put stuff out there and there hasn't been a whole lot of interest, but you know, just keep doing it.
Yeah, and I think the more that those things get built into our culture, as Dr. Herndon alluded to before, I think they'll, you know, there will be more and more buy-in from community, from other folks, the more that we continue to put those out there. So like, as we, you know, even when we start, it's possible we may just get, you know, a few folks that are interested, but it'll grow as we show our commitment to that work, I think. I'm getting a little just uncertain around the why or how in the right to comfort, because that is such like a personal commitment, and so how I'm not sure how to get to a how as a collective board.
That's great, Curly. I was just thinking the same thing. I was about ready to put my finger on that one.
I have some ideas. We'll talk about some tools in the next half of this that you can look into using.
Yeah, and just that importance of being able to do that, because if we're not really clear on how we're doing the how, what happens is we go right back to the status quo. Right? Like we go right back to the thing that we say that we don't want to do. And so recognizing that that's a part that's going to happen too. And so then it's like leaning in that leaning back into say like, oh, I think we're going over here again. Like we need to kind of lean back on our, it's okay to be uncomfortable, and it's okay to have these conversations. It's okay to rumble. And you're calling each other in, you know, it's that warmth of our humanity, I think, is like, it's like how it feels in me, like, because it's recognizing that it's hard and recognizing that it's necessary, and recognizing that you can do it together as a group, and that the status quo is to not do any of that.
And just to say too, that one thing that we've sometimes seen is what you want to also just kind of be aware of and intentional about trying to avoid is we don't want to weaponize any of this, right? So it's not, you know, talking about these transformational values. It's not about saying, Matthew, you're doing either or thinking again. You know, you're a bad thing, right? If we start practicing, if we do things in the way, it's possible to try to do things that are transformative in a way that's harmful, right? So it really is all about practicing that new way of being. And so if we do see ourselves reverting, and it's going to happen because that's how we've all been socialized and conditioned over all of our years, you just know that it's going to happen, and normalize being able to say, hey, I'm wondering if this is a good opportunity for us to practice getting out of either or thinking, or I wonder if this is a time where we're reverting to, you know, perfectionism, and if we can try practicing the thing that we agreed that we were going to practice, right?
Yeah, there's that empathy, that warmth, and that empathy piece in there, which is really important. Amy, I'm wondering if this is like a good transition point into where you're going.
It really is, actually. I'm ready to dive in, but would it be helpful to take a little break? Would a 5 or 10 minute break to, you know, do a little bio break, get a drink of water or tea or something? So 10 minutes, does that sound good?
Before we do that, Amy, I want to show the rest of the questions, because I just want to, like, I don't know if this is the right way to put it, but like pass these questions on, because like I think these are questions that you'll continue to rumble with in terms of what's next, like both today and you know, down the road. Is like, once you identify these practices, like then it's like, how will you extend those to the community, right? How would that look like in the decisions you make? And then what does accountability look like? And I think that accountability question is really important, and to get outside of the frame of what we usually think about what accountability means is like a call out, is like a gotcha. But it's like, how do we call each other in as a form of accountability? So I just wanted to put those questions out there before we. So it's just it's sprinkled on top. It's a little bit of a seasoning. Okay, done.
No, that sounds great. So do you want to? So we can. I'm going to turn off my camera as well. Maybe get back ready to go for 10:30.
Yeah, I'll pause the recording and start it again at 10:30.
That's lovely. Okay, so we'll see you in 10 minutes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I've started the recording again, just so you know. So
Thanks, Dr. Herndon. Appreciate that.
Whenever we're ready to go.
Right. Yeah, no, it was just nice to stand up a little bit. It was good.
Yes.
So thank you. And Carly, I'm just going to introduce myself really quick since we haven't gotten the chance to meet. Thanks so much For serving Tukwila, my name's Amy. I am a leadership consultant with WASDA. I also I'm starting my 3rd term on the North Shore School Board. So I know what it means for the position you're stepped into. And so it's just amazing that you're serving. Thank you. It's nice to meet you. And, when I was preparing for today, I was going back through my notes. The first time I got to work with the Tukwila team, I came down in person right before COVID struck. I think it was January 2020. We got to be in person. We were talking about board self-assessment results and all. It's been a great experience being able to work with you all over so much time. And so I was very cognizant of that while I was thinking about how to keep helping you all build your work. And so that is a little introduction to where I'm helping kick us off here. And I am setting up my desktop. It's like, how do I squeeze so much into my little screen here in the virtual facilitation world? But as a way to process this, I have some ideas about how to help, what we were just talking about here with Matthew and Eileen and all the work you all have been doing and how to weave that into your work, right? And moving forward, I have some thoughts, but I want to hear from you all. So in terms of where you would like to go, it can be so helpful before I rattle on about this idea for a tool to use as a board, this idea. What is the desired end state for you all? Like what, if we're going to choose some tools here and start designing some things, sometimes it's helpful to name where you want to be and helps you design. But so does anyone have anything? This is not a requirements, but would anyone like to voice really where you're hoping to get to? Yeah, Dave, thank you.
So I guess what I was thinking about, if we're talking about collaborating within the board, it seemed like the next logical would be to kind of figure out, what different people are interested in and passionate about, and then see if we can find some overlaps, and then maybe set up. I mean, we're operating under OPMA or whatever, but committees of 2 or whatever that can go off and pursue something in whatever those areas are.
That's a great idea.
That was kind of what I was thinking.
I think for me, this is really broad, but like where everyone is empowered and feels like a member of a collective team. So empowered with a voice that are all grounded in a shared goal or shared vision. And each bringing our unique lenses and also sharing a lens.
Great. Yeah, no, I'm taking great notes, great thoughts there, Carly. Thank you.
For me, part of where we go, or part of what we bring, comes from our story. Our story of our own educational experience, our life experience, our expertise, our trained expertise, whatever those things are. And I feel like I don't know everybody's kind of backstory and what they've dealt with, what they've lived through, what has impacted who they are. And to me, that's really important, so that I can see people at a deeper level than I think we have been.
That is something that doesn't come up very often in formal professional development for school boards, Jan, but it's a really good point, because OPMA is honestly an impediment to simple socializing as a unit, right? And so there are things you can do. I mean, COVID has really made this challenging, but if there's ways you can think about this, perhaps put it on a board agenda for your next business meeting of coming up with a space and a time to get together, just to talk about, yeah, your families, like what do you have going on outside of school board work? And you can publish that as a meeting. So I know several boards who have this as a practice. Think, for instance, when boards go to WASDA annual conference, they'll have a dinner together and you publish that as a public meeting. So you're very transparent with the community and you just don't talk about school board business. And so not only does it help you comply with OPMA, you get that rich relationship building.
And that's basically what I thought this retreat was going to be, and how we've used our retreat time. The one time we did a retreat that I've been on the board, we did that. We met at a restaurant. We noticed it as a public meeting.
Yeah.
But basically we just spent time talking to one another and building those relationships.
Another way we can do it is to, and you know, our board has been interested in more restorative practices, circle practices. We actually could build in aspects in every meeting or a piece. So like we actually, like as part of circle work is, you know, there's a prompt and we all go around and share kind of, or maybe a reading or something. And that, so like, it doesn't necessarily have to be either or, and like brought out of our business, we could actually transform how we do our regular board meetings.
Right. As long, you know, with spending time to think about how to weave that into, you know, the, you know, approval of minutes and, you know, just, you know, you can take care of the requirements of a business meeting, you know, right, in different ways. That's a very good idea. And
but I being a pretty private person, I really would like to have a heads up about those sharing things, because again, I don't like being caught off guard about what I'm going to be sharing.
That's a helpful point, Edna. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, and I think to piggyback off of that, you know, I think there's, you know, if we're looking for times to be vulnerable about, particularly like, you know, our history and our family is the things that Jan spoke to, which I think are very important. I think there is room to be cautious around doing that in a very public forum, particularly, you know, I mean, that could be harmful for, you know, my family or other people's families. But I think there's also value in the idea of weaving certain parts into the meeting, because I think that also helps us decolonize, right? How we do business as a whole. So I love the idea of prompts, restorative circles, and then separate time to really, you know, learn about each other and our histories. And so we can have vulnerability without exposing and putting people at potential harm, I think.
That's a really nice way of wording it, Carly. And I want to point out the fact too, I don't think we realize this until we experience it, but having to, you know, find a way of doing school board business safely and move into a virtual environment, you miss the interactions that again are, you know, are within the bounds of OPMA before and after a meeting, right? As you're walking in and say, oh, how's your day? Oh, I just came from my work, this, right? Like just those casual interactions that you miss in a virtual environment. That doesn't have to be all about deep sharing, but again, learning more about each other's backgrounds and experiences, and just, you know, again, like the simple day-to-day of what your family is like in a way that's not up on the formal dais. It has an impact. So any other, you might be causing me to slightly change my agenda here, which is a good thing, right? This is why I want to hear from you. So any other thoughts about, you know, again, the kind of the desired end state? Oh, I think you're,
yeah,
thanks
I got it. Yeah, I think it's about, once again, modeling the
Mhm.
change that we want to see, like the change that we're hoping, or that more people are feeling more comfortable to engage on different levels. And then the other thing I'll share is, because this comes up because I train human service professionals, that we are always, always self-disclosing. We disclose in how, clothes we're wearing, our mannerisms, if we open our mouths or not, we're disclosing, and our community is picking up on and paying attention to that. And so that's the other thing I'll just sort of put out there, is that we always self-disclose in different ways.
Right. Well, and it's helpful to be aware of that. And that probably, I think we might even subconsciously realize that as board members when we feel like we're in a fishbowl sometimes. It can be a challenge. So, when I was putting this together after talking with Bridget and Jan, there was the list of possible topics that was put together by the team, right? And it occurred to me that a theme that I was seeing was a desire to take all this lovely, incredible, I'm commending you, all this equity work you're doing as a team, and not just as a board with Dr. Herndon, right? As a true governance team, and weaving that into your board practices, right? And there are some tools that can help you do that. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit. But this kind of helps me make sure we cover some areas. So I'm bringing us back to this. This is something that Carly obviously didn't have the benefit of seeing. Right. Again, I went back through our notes when we came together the first time. We were going through the board self-assessment that was done at the time, and talking about what research has shown, that the actions boards can take, their actual work, and then how they do the work, how this can be done in a way that does boost student achievement. Okay. And so I'm bringing this back up. This is somewhat older research, right? So there's some deficiencies to it, but for the most part, it kind of captures, again, the what school boards do and the how, and how it's best done in order to help support student achievement. And so I just wanted to bring this up and see, in fact, if you have, just as a side comment, it might be time to think about doing the board self-assessment survey again. It might be something to think about for this year, because it's been a couple of years since you've done it. It can be helpful work. But, I want you to think about here, if you were to categorize the work done, this is ranked obviously top 1 through 10 of actions from the board standards that boards can do that are positively correlated to student achievements. And also how the board works with each other. And so this is my thought to you, if you were to apply an anti-racist lens to this, right? Would there be anything here that pops out to you that is something that really resonating with where Tukwila is at this time? Like, is there an area here, again, thinking of that destination in mind, that we can focus on, right? That you can start to weave all your anti-racist work into? So there's one here that actually I wrote down because it was something, Carly has said it. Number 7, Carly, does that look familiar to you? Committing to a clear and shared purpose, right? That work, spending time to do that as a board, sets direction for the whole organization. It helps clarify how you approach your work and how you prioritize your work. Right? It's very important. That was something that you all talked about. Anything else here that either looks familiar that you all have talked about, or perhaps is something that an area of opportunity to weave your equity work into?
Well, of course, the 2 words that we talk about all the time is collaboration and communicate.
Mm-hmm. And that was, having, and we're going to talk about something here that might help that. That was actually something that popped up through the possible topics document too, finding tools to help collaborate and communicate.
I think it's interesting, number 10, base its decision on what is best for students. We are so far from students' success right now. We are at students' health and wellness in the pandemic. And I do think that we've worked really hard to discern what's best for the whole, knowing that we aren't going to do what's best for, or what seems to be named as best for each student. That just caught my eye.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that word success, how that is defined, I think is something that a lot of boards spend a lot of time on, how you want to define what success is. Okay, and there's a lot of these actually that are very intuitive to the Tukwila team. I, as an observer, can tell you number 4 about expressing a belief that all students can learn, right? That is something that you all model really well. That's again, that commitment to equity. Okay, so now let's talk about, again, I don't want this to be, this is not siloed. This is building off of Eileen and Matthew's work with you, okay? But let's talk about a tool. So if we want to talk about all these things, and I was taking notes along with Matthew, right? In terms of the aspects you want to practice and work on as a board. How do we take this collaboration and communication piece and make it stronger? There's a tool that y'all might have talked about. And actually, this is something that was on the list and we chatted in our planning thing, but a community agreement, which in some organizations are called group norms. Okay. So, what this is a tool to work on the how. So, we can use policy. There's your operating principles that if we have time, we'll touch on, that talks about a lot of the what a board can do together. We're working on the how, creating that culture of shared trust, creating a practice of collaboration, a practice of being able to have those conversations, just like Matthew was talking about. If it turns out one of your colleagues or yourself might be slipping into the status quo a little bit, how can you help as a team pull back out of it? Having a framework to do that, have that practice, community agreement can really help with. And again, I'm working, I like the term community agreements better than group norms, but most people call them norms. I find even within education, people still call them, right, norms. And another analogy is it's traffic rules. Like if you think about it, if we drove around town without traffic rules, it would be chaos. It would cause accidents. Road rage would be like through the roof, right? But just understanding how to work a yield, what happens if you come to a stoplight and the power's out, and how you process that as like a community, that's all these community agreements are supposed to do. Just help establish some rules of the road in the beginning, so that as you do your work, you have a common understanding. And then it just helps you do the work. It's not supposed to be the work, it's supposed to support the work. Oh no, Matthew, 4-way stops. Oh my gosh. I have to say, so one of the side effects of growth in the Puget Sound region is an evolution away from 4-way stops to actual stoplights. I think that was a great evolution, an outcome of population growth. I'm just saying. So this is something I think we're going to work on here. We're going to create a community agreement for the Tukwila governance team. Okay, building off of the conversations you just had with Matthew. So let's just popcorn out. Think about it. What are some benefits besides the traffic rules? A little bit, let's think a little deeper. What are some benefits of having community agreements?
Trust would be a benefit, I would think.
Oh my gosh, right. And why do you think that is, Jen?
If we have agreed on how we will behave with one another, I would hope that we could trust that we will behave that way.
Well, and it reduces misunderstandings, accidental misunderstandings, right?
Yeah.
Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I was gonna say, it creates a way for us to engage in conversation that truly honors the individuals that we're in community with.
Right. I'm going to go through a list here so we can dive into the work soon. So it allows for a growth mindset too. So, and it kind of asset-based thinking, like if you think about it, you know, again, conversations we had earlier, you know, when you think about, for example, STEM knowledge from the point of view of Indigenous people, that's an asset-based way of thinking, a growth mindset-based way of thinking. And when you start talking about students that are multi-language as opposed to English language learners, right? It just, it turns the whole culture around. And so by having community agreements, it's acknowledging that we are all human and can make mistakes. So let's think about how we can grow in our practice and support each other doing that. It creates a climate of belonging. I don't know who all, I am totally geeking out about, in fact, you see it on the slide in a second, right? Belonging through a culture of dignity, like creating a culture of belonging is so important, both to model as a school board, as well as to create just as a culture within your district. And, you know, this is something that Carly was touching on, and simplifies behavior, having those rules of the road. You can create a brave space if there's trust, right? People can feel comfortable to be brave and honest. And this is, you know, the ideal is that you create a place where people can be their authentic selves as well. Building the trust and help avoiding embarrassing situations. Again, being in a fishbowl as a school board member, when you're in a recorded meeting in front of the public and you say something that you really wish you could take back, it happens to all of us. It has happened to me. And so creating a framework, and we're going to practice here too. We're going to do a little role playing. And what happens if someone does say something inadvertently, how you can help with that, how to address it. And then again, you're modeling behavior. Just like Eileen said, this is, it's not as well understood as I think some school board members should realize how much their behavior sets the tone for the rest of the organization. So, and again, oops, let me go back here. So from this book, also by coming up with some community agreements, you're creating the 4 core dispositions for dignity, which are empathy, patience, openness, and listening. And that if you want to dive into the book, you can, but again, it just sets a culture. So we're going to think about this. I'm going to show my thoughts here, and then I'm going to screen share over to some notes that I took from when you were just working with Matthew. But let's brainstorm a little bit on some agreements here. And so I want you to think about, from past experience, you know, think of a group that you were in, either, you know, within the Tukwila School District. You all are so involved in so many other groups, but a group that was able to make progress toward a goal. What are some habits they exhibited? Okay, so I want you to take a few minutes. I'm going to pull up the notes from before, and we will, if I can not have my screen be so crazy here. I'm going to take notes, and I want you to do me a favor. It's helpful when you create community agreements that you include not just a description, but an action word, a verb, right? And so, you know, for example, you know, I have some examples of other norms or community agreements. You'll notice it is always, it helps clarify. It's not just about the right to comfort, but maybe working to overcome, or working, or, you know, like what do you want to do about the right to comfort, if that makes sense? So think about that too. It's not just about a description, but about helping build a habit, which involves a verb. Okay, so I'm going to change what I'm sharing. And then I'm going to go around and ask you all for your thoughts. So if you're not quite ready to share, if you still are processing, which is okay, then we'll just pass. Okay, so there's the notes. So I'm going to start a second, because if you want to build off of this list, or you have something new to share, it's all good. I just want to take notes as we're talking. So if we can start with Jan, is there anything that pops to mind, any habits of groups that you've seen successfully working well together and advancing towards their goal?
What came to mind was openness to the unknown end point, not having an end point in mind at the beginning.
Okay.
Openness to the development of an endpoint, or
The evolution of an endpoint?
basically
Okay.
it's just not knowing the end before you start.
And I'm just going to note here too, it's okay if these aren't worded perfectly, because this is going to be a draft, right? So no pressure, no pressure. So Edna, what about you? Oh, you're muted, Edna.
Mutual respect and validating others.
And when you say validating others, can we be a little bit more, because that can be pretty broad. What do you think of validating others?
I guess partially accepting what others say to have some merit. I'm not sure that everybody's viewpoint has a quality, a value. I'm not sure.
Well, no, that, yeah, let's validating others' experience or
viewpoints, attitude, well, not attitudes.
Not attitudes, right.
But viewpoints.
So sometimes, yeah, no, continue.
Well, I just think that a lot of that, the mutual respect and validating others' experiences, comes from knowing each other better.
Mm.
And yeah, but.
Well, and do I have some examples we can show. Sometimes there is a very common norm from Norm's list about looking or presuming positive intent.
Mm-hmm.
So, which might be plain in this, I think it is important to retain that intent versus impact thoughts, right? But in terms of, starting from a place of presuming positive intent, but developing the skills to also expect and have a conversation about impacts too. So having mutual respect, I want to make sure I'm capturing this and not just brainstorming with you to the point I'm diluting your thought, Edna. That's not very helpful. So having mutual respect is very important. I'm just going to keep that on its own. Or how about cultivating? Because if you're talking about learning about each other, right? Cultivating a mutual respect might be important. And then validating others' experiences. I'll leave that there, right? Because again, this is a draft. This doesn't have to be perfect.
Maybe adding and insights, not just experience, but their insight.
Right, there you go. Or maybe instead of validating, what about appreciating? Or I will leave it as validating.
Probably both.
Okay, let's do that. Okay, Dave, any thoughts?
Yeah, so the question was working in other groups, what did I notice? And so sharing information.
Let's talk about that first. So sharing information in what way?
Yeah, just kind of everybody sharing what knowledge they have on the particular area or subject.
Yeah, so sharing information is like with all parties, making sure the whole group has access to the same information. Do you mean sharing from personal experiences?
Yeah,
sharing.
both of those, all of those. In other words, not withholding information.
Oh, okay.
So just,
Mhm.
and then the other one I had was kind of listening deeply, or
Ooh. That actually comes, that's the other side of sharing, right? If someone's sharing, listening deeply for understanding is really important.
yeah, I mean, there's a whole lot of situations where you get in a meeting or whatever, and you're trying to think about, okay, what are you going to say next? And then you don't have any space in your brain to actually hear what somebody else is saying.
Yep.
So that can be sometimes tricky.
Mhm. All right, thank you. And I'm just going around my circle here. So again, if you want to pass, but I think this has been really fun. Bridget, what thoughts do you have? Oh, she typed for me. Okay, so let's see here. I'm just going to copy and paste in here, and then we will unpack it. Build and maintain transformation relationships with each other.
Yeah.
So, right, this is building up on top. So building and maintaining transformational relationships with each other would cultivate a mutual respect, right? That is feeding in. That's great. Practice courageous conversations around race. So that is actually an example of list of norms I have for later. That might be something that would be, I'm going to italicize this. Usually that isn't something that's like a habit. That might just be a good group building activity, but usually not a habit per se. But I can pull up those norms that that are in there, because I pulled them up as they're very common examples. For the 4 agreements, acknowledge intent versus impact, and listening for understanding. Look at that. We have listening for understanding. So we already have that.
Yeah.
So,
So as long as I have Wi-Fi, I'll go ahead and I think that, when interacting or communicating, utilizing the model, like, because I know, like, that's one of the practices that I try to listen to
mhm,
hear, where, in terms of where someone is coming from, and
mhm,
so I think in relationships, an ongoing process. And so with relationships, how can we have our relationships be transformational with each other, so that we can be that type of board that is moving forward transformation and transformational relationships with our community. And then the 4 agreements have been used by several of us just in the work we do, but
mhm,
then also in our community groups that are in existence already. And so, like, and it can be very helpful for those uncomfortable conversations, and to sort of help just like have a shared common, kind of know that we're kind of on this journey together, and here's the parameters. And then the intent versus impact. So as a group, that whenever, to be able to recognize that and own and learn from each other impact, and to clarify maybe intent, but ultimately the impact of
mhm.
what we say, what we do.
Right. Right. And we will, yeah, when we do our little role playing, we'll practice that a little bit, because it's actually the ability to have tools to process intent versus impact is a sign of a really well functioning group. And so, and you can't have one without the other, right? You can't talk about impact without processing the intent. Like, you want to keep them both in balance. Just focusing in on intent, and then the impact conversation needs to build off of the intent, but in a way that's healing, right? So that's something to definitely process, and I want to, again, I'm going to highlight this because that's something really important to build off of. So Carly, any thoughts?
Yeah. So mutual and shared accountability. And then like a shared commitment and also like a shared distribution of work. And on the flip side, like the support from each other, so like pick each other up, right? So that goes into like ownership of individual work and transparency, and like when we're succeeding, when we need help. Yeah. Happy to talk more.
No, that's really helpful. That's really helpful. And I want to throw out two. So how would we weave in, if we haven't already? So right to comfort, that concept there, again, it's missing a verb, but how would that, perhaps right to comfort would, avoiding isn't quite the right verb, but see how the verb is so important. So the concept around right to comfort and working as a board away from that could play into acknowledging intent versus impact, right? So are there any of these that we can weave in together to what we just discussed below? So we can capture them, right? Again, we're building norms that weave your equity work in together. So power sharing could support practicing mutual and shared accountability and work, right? So what I'm going to do here, yeah, and I'm going to take that note here in a second, Bridget. So I'm going to put power sharing concept here. And so welcome discomfort is part of the 4 agreements, right? And also, I'm going to put that also, Bridget, do you agree with acknowledge intent and versus impact?
Amy, I'm a bit confused. Some of the ones you have up on top are the inner circle and some are the outer circle. And my understanding is we're working toward the outer circle. So we're not working toward right to comfort.
Right.
Unless,
you know what? Thank you, Jan. That does clarify. So let me bring the circle up, because then, like, for example, the power sharing, right? So I get to the circle. So yeah, if you can help me word, because we do want to avoid.
Yeah, it's
right here. It is. So,
expect discomfort or welcome discomfort. Yeah.
Right there.
Yeah.
So
I guess my question and my bigger question on all of this is, and this is probably my old work that I still need to do, but how does safety, and I know nothing is safe, but there can still be safety in a place for growth, I would think. And for me, what our approach together has to allow for some safety in the midst of growth. So if someone says something that doesn't work for the rest of the group, it has to be approached in a way that still provides space for that person to feel like they belong. And we can use the belonging language for that.
Right.
And there's something about safety in that is not the same as comfort, but it does keep a person engaged and in place and supported in the midst of growth. Does that make any sense to anybody?
Yeah, Jan, can I pop in here for a sec? The word safety is always kind of a trigger word for me, because it's like, safe for who, right? So if we're looking at like how privilege exists for different folks, like especially if we're talking about right to comfort, like a reframe of that word for me is always brave or courageous. Because if we're in a space where we're being listened to and valued, that courage and that bravery is like our way of being able to speak our truth and like lean in and still be in like an empathetic relationship with everybody, right? But a lot of times the safety is in direct link to right to comfort, because if if our relationship to like being racially comfortable in spaces 24/7, like I'll just say like that's a part of how we get conditioned as white people. So we can feel uncomfortable in spaces and maybe not feel safe because we haven't built up that capacity and that tolerance for heat, right? Because we haven't spent as much time doing that. So I want to approach that word with caution and maybe think about, are there other words that can embody like what it is to lean in ways that might feel a little bit scary, but we're still honoring our relationships and our stories and our humanity with each other. Does that make sense?
So let's do this. Let's maybe do a role play, and this might be helpful. There are some strategies which we're going to be on a later slide. I was going to dive into. There are a couple strategies that can be used to help support a growth mindset around these topics, right? And I as a point to not avoid discomfort, but to move through it. Right. And so maybe Jan, that can help you see where we're talking about here. So say I am the 6th board member. I'm going to be the 6th school board member of Tukwila. And we are sitting in a school board meeting. And let's see here. We're having a very, very deep conversation on how to realign curriculum in the middle school. Okay, and so say that this list of community agreements has been formalized, all the drafts are done, and we have one here, listening deeply for understanding. And so it can be very stressful talking about curriculum because no school district has enough resources, trying to figure out how to get the best out of your resources. We're talking about middle school, maybe trying to figure out how to detrack math in middle school. So I'm the 6th school board member and y'all are sitting next to me, and I am getting so passionate and so heated on this, Jan, that I keep talking over you. So you're trying to talk about your viewpoint about middle school curriculum, and I'm not listening deeply for understanding. I am going, this is my concern. This is what I've seen with my own child is in the district. This is what I feel, blah, blah, blah. I'm not listening deeply for understanding. So there are a couple of techniques you could use if this is what I'm doing as a school board member that doesn't shame me or embarrass me in public, right? Because I think that safety word maybe could be, instead of doing that, we can help each other grow and not publicly shame each other, because publicly shaming each other doesn't model anything for our district. So if I'm talking over you, first of all, another school board member can pop up. Carly can use one technique is reflective questioning. Carly could go, Amy, what I'm hearing you're saying is that I'm hearing you say that you are really concerned about our middle school students in math. I'm hearing you say that, but you're not allowing Jan to speak her point of view. And so I would appreciate it. Let's just give her some time. So I'm not being publicly shamed, I'm being acknowledged, and that reflexive questioning. Or say I say something that is really harmful on this topic. Say I'm sitting there saying, oh my gosh, this process is not working. Our executive director of curriculum obviously does not have students' interests in mind, and I don't know what they're thinking, right? That's another point where you could maybe there's a couple strategies you can do with that one. So you could, and again, we're human, right? We get passionate. And so, but I'm creating an impact, even if my intent, so this is the intent versus impact, right? Even if my intent is a passionate concern for students and not being tracked in math. So there's a couple strategies you can do here in terms of reflective questioning. You can say, okay, or you can just, say, have a couple phrases, and this is what's helpful too. I'm going to go back to sharing my PowerPoint and getting to the phrases, okay? They're the strategies to help each other. So those are norms examples. Okay. Okay. So reflective questioning. So say that I say something inadvertently like that executive director of curriculum obviously does not care about our students. Someone could stop me and say, Amy, okay, what I think you just said, I think I'm concerned you just questioned the integrity of a staff member. I'm sure that's not what you meant, right? And give me the chance to correct myself, okay? Or what I really think is a great strategy is for a school board, for a team, a government's team, to come up with phrases. So, for example, if what I was doing there, I'm not listening deeply for understanding, right? I'm not acknowledging mutual respect for a staff member. There can be a couple phrases that you all have in your, that you've agreed upon to help stop a situation from getting worse. So for example, Carly, I'm sorry, I'm picking on you, Carly. Carly could say, Amy, you know what? I don't believe that's a transformational practice to approach that problem in this way. So this is what I suggest instead. So maybe like, because you are working so much on this transformational framework, you could use a phrase like that. You know, and they don't have to be very complicated. It could be, Amy, or just, you can refer back to the list of norms. I don't believe you are listening for understanding or building a solution. You know, there can be some phrases that you can think of. And something else to think about too is to think about having a conversation outside the public meeting as well. If I'm getting so worked up that it deserves a deeper conversation outside the public meeting in terms of, you know, working together to coach each other and like, okay, you're very passionate, you know, acknowledging the passion around helping students, but your practices weren't moving the conversation forward. All right, so we can do some other examples. Does that help, Jan? Because the question that you raise is important, Jan. So we want to, it's about growing in a way that moves the group forward. Sometimes, but it's going to be uncomfortable, but doesn't mean we have to be shamed. So, but I'd love to hear what anyone thinks about this.
Bridget put something in the chat earlier, and I think it was when Matthew was talking around Jen's question about communicating boundaries for space and for time. And I think that would be something really interesting to explore because, I mean, I know for myself, sometimes it takes me a little bit longer to process, especially when, I mean, I recognize too that this is like a perfectionist thing, right? So wanting to make sure that I say things in the right way, communicate my intent, right? And understand the impact before I say things. So that can often take a little bit of time. So I think just understanding what our own need for boundaries are while also leaning into the hard, right? So I think it could warrant some discussion around that because that could help if we're feeling our sense of something, especially if we want to explore, like if we're feeling unsafe and we want to explore why that might be and dissect that a little bit to then be able to understand, okay, maybe it was really something else, or maybe it was my, wrong understanding. So I think boundaries, and it goes into what you were saying about finding another time to talk about that.
Right. Yeah, thank you. No, that's helpful, Carly. Well, yeah, and Bridget's point about avoiding silence or shutting down, I think, to Edna's point, there's some people who need more time to process quietly. I tend to be a verbal processor, which Eileen and Matthew can attest to, because when we were planning this workshop, I just I process verbally. And if someone is not a verbal processor, it can be a different strategy that is just how people, right? Luckily, Eileen is a verbal processor too, but right, like it's and it's something I catch myself constantly apologizing for, because I feel like I'm intruding people when I'm processing out loud. But you know, constructive silence can be helpful, and especially if people want to think deeply about something that's really valuable to the team and organization, and they need some time to verbalize that.
So yeah, it's helpful as part of just, each of us have our own set of boundaries to communicate that this is an important issue. I'm thinking about it. So that's what I would say too, is that, I'll just share, like, there's experiences on the board where something uncomfortable happens and then there's just silence.
And so silence, and Carly's point here, reflective versus avoidance, there is, let me pull up here there's another school board I pull up some norms for. So example from another school board, in terms of, again, not perfect, every group, and these are captured in time, but in terms of listening with an open mind and different opinions are okay. Avoiding conflict, I think, is pretty impossible as a school board, because again, you have very important mission with very limited resources. If we had unlimited resources, we probably would have not nearly as much conflict as we have, let alone all the other factors that play into providing education to a community. So, let's talk about this silence here for a second. Is it easy to distinguish between reflective and avoidance, or is it tricky to assume? To understand, maybe a practice would be having a question we could ask as a board, right? Because again, if some people just need time to reflect, and you don't want that to be misinterpreted, but it could be important to process a difficult question. So what's a question that could be posed as a board about silence that would, again, help the group move forward? And flip on Dr. Herndon's position, I have to say Dr. Herndon's point I find to be really true, because the role of body language is something that I didn't appreciate on I didn't often appreciate on a board until we were all virtual. And actually facilitating virtually, I miss out on body language so much. When I see someone leaning in like they need to talk, or body language like they're pulling back, in terms of Matthew, I might have I have a colleague on my school board who is an incredibly deep introvert. So, and it is like to the point where if we are doing a workshop and you're kind of forced to provide, that's why I always let people pass. Like if she's ever forced to provide feedback when she's not ready, it actually makes her withdraw. And so silence, I tend to, just because of my relationship with her, I might have a different view on silence. It might be just a different way of processing information.
Yeah, I think to Matthew's point, like, I think for me, that can definitely certainly be true. And so I think that's where, like, the reflective and knowing ourselves and being willing to say, okay, my silence right now is a manifestation of my perfectionism, and not me being reflective. So I think that's where that personal work and understanding and awareness comes in. And I think having a question is a great idea.
Or maybe someone can say, I just need more time. Right? If someone just needs more time, I just need more time. And you know what? And it's a healthy practice if if a topic is really complicated, to take more than one meeting to process it. So if again, middle school curriculum is a hefty topic and might take multiple meetings to go through it, if a board member needs more time, then you can create a really stressful dynamic, forcing them to participate on a schedule when they're not ready. And if you want to have a cycle of trust, if someone is uncomfortable, they should be able to say that. If I need more time, you know, I still have concerns, I need to research, right? And it's healthy to be able to let a person say that without placing judgment. I think we have to be careful around judgment.
I think too, this goes back to getting to know each other better. And knowing our personal reactions to things or ways that we deal with things. And I think we're lacking that within our group.
Mm-hmm. You know, I think this question around silence is a really interesting one. I think there can be, it can be hard to presume why someone is being silent, right? It can, and just by the very nature of it, it can be hard to presume. And so, you know, if let's go back to our norms here. So say we're on the dais and we typed up, you know, especially the bottom set of bullets, and say silence pops up during this conversation about math curriculum because things have gotten stressful. You know, if you want to cultivate mutual respect, you know, assuming why there's silence might not be the best way to do that. Maybe a way of cultivating mutual respect would be to question, does anyone need more information on this topic? Does anyone need more time on this topic? Does anyone want to hear you know, have we gone through and gotten enough community input on this topic? Figuring on why the silence sometimes might be a symptom, it might be a problem, but it might be a symptom of something else too. I'm sorry, but it's just started working.
Okay. As part of circle practices,
Mhm.
everybody has an opportunity to share as we go around. So maybe that's another aspect that, you know, once somebody shares, then we all have the opportunity to share. And right now we don't really create space for each of us. Like it's sort of so, and if someone doesn't want to share, they may say, you know, I don't have anything to add at this time, or, you know, I'm still listening, I'm still thinking, you know, like kind of honoring. So I'm wondering if so like say someone shares something and all of a sudden there's silence, do we have a practice in place that opens it up to the circle? So maybe it's, you know, I'm hearing concerns here. I'm wondering what each of us kind of, you know, what we're hearing. I'm wondering here I sound like a therapist again. I'm wondering what each of us, but that's a different dynamic, by the way. So that's what I'm, you know,
Right.
I'm trying to pull in the circle practice as sort of the frame here. And you know, I'm wondering that, you know, if anyone else has thoughts, feelings, ideas, you know, what do we want to do with this? Like kind of just invite, but then actually have kind of that expectation that each of us are to answer and how we want to answer. So including nothing at this time.
Right. Right. So what if though someone is getting uncomfortable with the how, and I don't know if it's often, it might be around the topic, but I mean, math curriculum, perhaps it's not about the topic. I want to stay with that example. But what if someone is getting uncomfortable, again, if discomfort is going to happen and someone's worried, they might say something that's going to be misinterpreted. How can we create a culture of helping each other grow through that? Right, because that's, I think a human reaction to discomfort is not wanting to make it worse, right? So how can we help each other move through it in a way that respects everyone, creates mutual respect? What's something we could say if a conversation is getting uncomfortable?
Well, I think I kind of like Bridget's approach there. I mean, my mind doesn't always work super fast. And so I need, to react to something kind of instantly is not, my mind just doesn't work that fast a lot of times. I need a little time to do it. But excuse me, inviting people to comment and then having the option to pass on it is I mean, that would be a pretty good option for me.
To add on to that, I think the idea of like even just stopping to do a pulse check, right, and listen, like even naming, right, so bringing the emotion or bringing the feeling into the space. So even if it's just, and if you can't explain it, like, right now I'm feeling really uncomfortable. I'm not really sure why I'm feeling super uncomfortable. I need to dissect that a little bit, but that's what I'm feeling. So then it brings awareness, some vulnerability, but also sets a boundary and allows folks who still maybe need to deconstruct the feeling time and space to do.
Well, can you say that last part again here, Carly? So in terms of, you acknowledge feeling uncomfortable and then allowing for that bit about boundaries. Yeah.
Yeah. So, again, doing a pulse check, how's everyone feeling right now? Name the feeling. And so if I'm feeling uncomfortable, not really sure why, I need a minute to digest. So it brings in that portion of boundary setting, and also increases vulnerability, transparency, and doesn't shut down things, but just acknowledges the impact that it's having on me. Now let me deconstruct and then come back.
Right.
And I really agree with that because it takes me a while to process. This getting old is hard. But it takes me a while to process. And when I'm silent, it's me processing, and I don't even have time to think about making a comment about why I'm silent. So if somebody calls me on it, then that might be of assistance, but it does take me a while to process. And everyone is so verbally eloquent on this team that my words just don't come out like theirs do. So I often feel, how can I say this? And by the time I figure out how to say it, the opportunities passed. So,
right.
yeah.
Well, I have to say, I am all about having like a pen and paper with me on the dais so I can capture thoughts, because you're trying to capture what you want to say. And again, you're in a fishbowl, say it in the best way possible as the conversation is continuing, right? It's complicated. And I want to ask, what's another way we can coach each other? So what if, and again, I think this is human nature, especially I can speak as being a white person. What if you're talking about a subject and say that, again, math curriculum in middle school, the tracking happens to impact students of color most, right? And so this is where intent and impact can get complicated, where I don't want, my intent is to help all students, each student, but I'm worried what I'm going to say is going to have the wrong impact. And that might be a reason for silence. How can we coach each other, right? I mean, because in that situation, intent is very relevant, but it doesn't help us all bring problem solving, right? Bring our own, move the team along together if we're worried our impact either might be adverse, might be misinterpreted, like a whole bunch of things. I think it's a human nature. So what's something we can say to create that brave space that allows us to try to be our authentic self without worrying that it's going to be misinterpreted? Is there a phrase we can use to coach each other maybe, or we can identify we're in that spot? Oh, Bridget, I can't hear you.
I'm so sorry.
It's
I'm
all right.
thinking I'm thinking that if any one of us are recognizing that one of us are vulnerable, that we don't leave them I'm not going to use that language. I'm sorry. That we don't leave them by themselves
Oh,
out there hurting. And
Mhm.
so I'm thinking that maybe even acknowledging or saying, you know, like kind of like this is what I'm hearing, or like when Edna was sharing about the getting older, I was just like, oh my gosh, yes, that is that's a thing, right? And so
Right.
so either a comment or acknowledgement, and we can do that in different ways, right? Like, and because we're not together in terms of body language or whatnot, that, you know, like if you know, do we need other ways to be able to do that? I'll give one more example because I'm going to acknowledge Dr. Herndon. Dr. Herndon does this really well, and he's done it really well for me. So like in terms of like, I'll just give the example, a very specific one at the beginning of the meeting where I bypassed the approval of the agenda. He was
Right.
able to sort of in a way to support me and to support the process in a very respectful way. So like just as a man of color, I really appreciate that, Dr. Herndon. I felt very supported navigating these very challenging structures that we have sometimes. So that's all I gotta say.
And, you know, if I can bring it back to, you know, I think we're building on where we might have started with, if you don't mind me, Jan, building on your comment about safety. Sometimes it's not about having to avoid discomfort. Sometimes it's needing support, right? And so if we can ask for support from our team, then that does help us be brave, right? And have these conversations, because we can't move the system into a truly anti-racist point of view if we can't be brave and vulnerable with each other. And again, then our staff can be vulnerable with each other. Our students and parents can be vulnerable with each other. You know, a little phrase I learned from one of my school board mentors when I first started is, a board member should act on the dais like you want a principal to act with the teacher, a principal to act with the parents, principal, right? Because, you know, you're a leader. And so you know, with each other, how would you, if you're feeling vulnerable, how would you want a principal to talk to a vulnerable feeling teacher? Right? It would be supportive. And so if it gets to the point where someone is actually feeling so vulnerable, they use the phrase that they're feeling unsafe, you know, that's something that we would want a leader in a building to rectify right away and create a culture of belonging. So, and bridging, what do you mean by a form of bridging, Bridget?
So this is how I understand it, or how I, at least what it means to me right now, is it's a way of practicing racial equity. And so like being able to, so leaning in, creating spaces, reframe, there's like just different ways to do the work. And to so that other people, if they, you know, they feel supported, they feel, you know, so it's kind of like it's connecting with someone kind of where they're at, and then trying to bring them along in their own development.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, bridging, that's a really great tool actually to help support each other if we feel vulnerable. You might feel vulnerable as a body too, right? As a team, not just individually.
Another thing that could be really beneficial is, you know, going back to kind of the different levels of racism. I think oftentimes, particularly as white folks in conversations, the vulnerability comes as a response of like feeling shame, or could be feeling shame or feeling guilt around and thinking that we are being put in this box of individual racism. And so if we could recenter it on the fact, like the institutional racism that we're actually discussing, again, recognizing there's still all this, you know, personal work, but I think reframing it so that it doesn't feel like individual attacks, and rather an examination and a deep dive into the institutional racism and the opportunity we have to explore that.
Yeah, reframing for each other, I think, is really helpful. Again, and that gets back to that reflective questioning skill you can do to help people reframe. It does help build trust for sure. Because again, like, you know, I know for sure, I've had times when things have come out of my mouth that I regret, and someone helped me reframe in the moment, and it was really helpful. I've had to do it when I was board chair. There were a couple of times where we had heated conversations. I called one of my colleagues afterwards and said, you know what you said? They did not remember saying it. I'm like, you could have said that. And so, but then it gave them the opportunity to repair it. Right. And so by not, it was a serious enough thing where, you know, that you do one level of intervention in the public meeting, but then a deeper level of intervention outside the public meeting, right? It's not like you ignore it, but you can do deeper intervention outside the public meeting. And then we grew and we grew. Okay, so any other thoughts? We can build on the list of norms if we want. There was something else I was going to bring up, but I don't want to close off this conversation too early. You're getting a lot of good, you know, this bottom set of tools is going to be really helpful for you.
I just wanted to kind of highlight a point that I've heard made earlier, because I do think it's important to hold in having this conversation. So clearly silence can happen for lots of reasons. You know, I've been a teacher and working with students who are more introverted and allowing people for processing time. And, you know, that's why teachers have strategies like wait times and those kinds of things, right? And in having conversations about racial equity, I just wanted to like re-highlight the fact that the impact of silence, particularly from white people, can be really harmful, even if it's not your intention, right? So one of the things we often hear from students of color, communities of color, is this horrible thing happened and nobody said anything. Or and that isolation of feeling like I'm the only one who felt this way or who feels this way or cares about this thing. Nobody cared about what happened to me. That can be an impact of silence. So that may not be intention and it can be impact. So I just want to offer that as a point of reflection. And I think these strategies are going to be really helpful so that doesn't happen, right? So just to acknowledge if you're taking that moment to process, like even just saying that and say like, that's horrible, or I hear you, I see you, I hear you. I need a minute to think about it because I'm an internal processor. Like being just so transparent about your own process, I think can alleviate those kinds of harmful impacts in that moment. So I just wanted to kind of bring that out there because there is like this communication about racial equity issues that's relevant. And you know that it comes up when we talk about safe spaces and all of those things too, right? So I just wanted to make sure that we're kind of holding on to that. And it's complex and there are lots of nuances and lots of reasons. Like I said, understanding that people have personal tendencies and just to be considering those things.
Thank you, Eileen. So, and I think, you know, the second here, let me separate these a little bit so they're easier to read. But, you know, this third one, the whole idea about letting people know and helping them reframe, frankly. So like if someone says something, and so what I heard you say, is that what you meant? The same thing can be applied to the silence. So if silence is happening, say, well, I don't know what this means, but how I'm interpreting the silence, perhaps, right? Like, so making sure that it's not, it could be a misunderstanding, but it could be something that needs to be talked about too. why the silence is happening.
A good self-reflective question that maybe is a strategy, and it would be an internal question too, that I've heard Matthew share in the past, is asking yourself, and it's a both and too, because sometimes you can take up too much airspace, right? So it's that wait, why am I talking? And then wait, why am I not talking? Right. So maybe that moment of asking yourself.
Let me put that up there. Yeah. And this is me using a little bit of silence to make sure everyone's had a chance, right, to contribute. Does anyone, is anyone still processing, would like to contribute either another norm? Okay, thank you. So I didn't hear it correctly. That one right there. Okay, so it's a colon. Thank you, Britt. So I misunderstood. I could not hear. See, another example why virtual, I didn't pick up on that. Virtual can be tricky. Okay, so let's go back and think from where we started today, right? In terms of taking the transformational partnerships framework, the work on white supremacy, and weaving it into practice as a board, right? There were, another quote I took down while Matthew was presenting about the oak trees with Katrina, holding each other in place while the storm is raging. These are all strategies and norms to help you do that. So some people, I'm going to send these notes. It might be nice and, always happy to help you do it. It might be nice to come back and look at them and redraft them. There might be something else you'd want to add. I do have a list of examples of other, the courageous conversation norms. There's some norms that are used in the WASDA onboard training. That example from another school board, there are things that are imperfect, might be helpful, might be something you hadn't thought about. I can send them along. But what can be helpful is to keep in mind that it's not about capturing. If you wanted to capture our whole conversation just now, it would be a book. It wouldn't be just a bullet list of norms. This is just to be reminders, right? So this isn't very consciously, is not to be an exercise in worshiping the written word where it's like, okay, it says cultivate a mutual respect. That's, it's much more nuanced and deeper than that. These are just supposed to help us remind ourselves. But you can have them, I was all about, I got very nervous when I was board president, and I would have kind of reminders around me, and having our norms really helped me when I'm trying to process a whole meeting and public comments, and having them there was helpful for me. It might be something for y'all to, I've seen boards take them and laminate them and give everyone, when you're physically in person, having them handy, or if you're doing it virtually, maybe you just have it open as a window on your computer. So you have the tool questions, you have some norms, and you can build off of it when you find your business, not only, the business of school board, perhaps getting into a logjam, but as you're thinking about the work in terms of, all right, for a middle school math curriculum, have we pulled in our community to get their input? Perhaps, it's not a curriculum that supports multi-language students. There's so many ways you can inform your work and keeping this handy. And another one of those I want to pull up, because this was also in the possible topics, was your operating principles. Okay, so operating principles are used by boards for a very similar process, and I can make this larger. This is really small. So this, it looks like it was written in 2017. So by a previous school board, right? Within Tukwila, and many school boards have these. So the idea is you're not only putting in norms around your group work and having community agreements around that, but it also talks about just the more, but not just the how, but also weaving in some what. So if you wanted to take the notes we have around community agreements and weave them into this, it's a common practice where school boards will review these operating principles every year, usually in the summer before the school year kicks off, or maybe in January, and see if there's anything that needs updating. You know, this was done 5 years ago. It was a very different world in 2017. There might be some takeaways, right, that we got from today that you'd want to weave into here. You know, if you look at this, you know, keep an open mind, you know, some of these, you know, that's very much, and see, that's not helping when I hover like that. That's very much a how. And there might be some updating to this that would weave in your anti-racist work. And then again, it creates just an understanding and just that those traffic rules. So, and I don't, we don't have time here with 9 minutes left to dive into them, but there are ways of processing and into them. What are you thinking, Edna?
Well, I'm thinking that, could you scroll down a little bit?
Sure. Tell me when to stop.
Keep going. It talks about the interim superintendent, and I think we need to change that wording.
Right. Well, that's what, as soon as I pull this up, Deborah sent this to me and I'm like, wait, interim superintendent. And then I saw the 2017 at the bottom, like, oh yeah. So it's, and you see how there's signature lines here. And there's something, I mean, obviously it's not a binding thing for a board director to do, but there's something emotional about signing on to some operating principles as a board in terms of signing on. And this also too can work in together agreements you have with your superintendent. Like if you look at number 13, again, they have that interim word in there, but the no surprises rules between a board and superintendent is a really important operating principle that really helps, again, cut down on misunderstanding and can really help, right? That's just something that a practice that people have. So it's not just about the board's work itself, it's about the governance team usually.
And I'd also just like to point out number 15, which says review and revise operating principles, which, you know, obviously we need to do. I mean, in the years I've been on, we've done it occasionally, but obviously needs to be done probably more often than has been done.
And one reason why it's often tied with board self-evaluation, when you do that self-evaluation survey, usually there, you know, through that, it's just a way of helping to quickly identify areas that boards want to help improve. And so then you can work those growth goals into the operating principles in order to keep yourself growing as a board.
And we've already started the process, right? Today, started the conversation and started to sort of start to build, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking about it in terms of transformational relationships. So like we could have potentially some norms or foundations, I call them foundations around relationship with board, relationship with superintendent, relationship with community. So we could potentially have, I mean, today we sort of zoned in on with each other and for each other, but I mean, we could, you know, definitely we will need to continue. And this is a great example of where having some time to process and keep thinking about it could be helpful.
Absolutely. I just put that down on the notes because that's a very good way to organize the document, perhaps. It could do with some restructuring, especially to weave in the notes, you know, in terms of the aspects from the transformational partnership to work on as a board, right? Like how to weave in that besides just some ideas around community agreements. So how often are you planning to get together to do retreats this year? Do you have one in the spring, or this can be starting a busy time of year for a school board? It might be something to think about, like agenda setting. I'd like to just help people with the with following up from a scheduling perspective. That's all. So that is, we have 5 minutes left. So are there any other takeaways in terms of, I'll send along the notes, right? We have some great thoughts, and looks like Matthew was taking some notes too.
We could practice circle in terms of sort of each of us maybe sharing a pearl of wisdom or something that resonates with them today.
That sounds great.
What do you all think?
Let's do that. So we're all right. We will do that. So as you framed it, Bridget, we'll share it with a pearl of wisdom, one takeaway that is top of mind. It doesn't have to be the only one. But I'm going to start in the middle of my circle. So Carly, since you got to be thrown in the deep end of the pool, and I have to say did very well today with a board retreat, new board member. What's a pearl of wisdom you're taking away from this?
So many things, but as I was looking back at just some of my notes, going back to the beginning and the slide around collaboration that Matthew showed, and a quote that you said that I wrote down is going to stick with me, is the idea of when we're collaborating well, we move slower, but we move deeper. And I love that, and that is certainly going to stick with me. So thank you. And thank you all for your time today and for being here.
Thank you. All right, moving around my circle. Jan, do you have any thoughts? Anything that pops up?
Yeah, I really appreciated the reframing language that you offered. That if I can do that for someone else in the future, I hope I can, because I felt like we didn't do it for me today. And I think that's important. Anyway, that's my thought.
Thank you, Jen. They do take practice. Edna, do you have any thoughts? Any nuggets?
Well, I have several, but I think I'll pass on sharing them because I just need to process.
Thank you. Thank you for letting us know. That's wonderful. Dave, do you have anything that you'd like to share?
So it sounds like kind of the next steps. We still haven't, I mean, there's a lot of talking about getting to know each other. And I think some people were thinking that was kind of the retreat was going to be maybe a little more about that. So sounds like that's still on the list of things to do. And then I think, yeah, taking the information that was talked about today and incorporating them into an operating principle or whatever, and restructuring that document or whatever, I think is something that needs to be done as well.
Great, thank you, Dave. And Bridget?
So a pearl for me is dirt, and how looking at each of our own stuff, right? Like what does that mix look like? And then of course we're sharing dirt. And so what does that look like? And then the other thing is I just want to acknowledge, like, I'm just feeling like we did good work together today, just to start though, right? Like there's definitely a lot more to do, but I just want to acknowledge the work that we did today, and thank you everyone.
Thank you for that. And Dr. Herndon, do you have any thoughts? I mean, your wisdom is an asset to the board for sure. What's your takeaway from today?
Well, thank you. Yes, I just want to help play a role in supporting each board member in whatever it is they feel they need to continue to either communicate with each other or just reflect. I mean, I'm happy to also just be someone to listen to, and several do come in and ask questions, and we do have conversations. So I always appreciate that, and I want to make sure people know that I'm available for that.
Which is wonderful. Thank you. So I will send my notes along, right? And if there anything else besides that that we can support you with, it's right on 12 noon. All right. Thank you for spending your Saturday morning improving your service to your students.
Thank you, Amy.
So then we just need the, just to reflect again, we just need the formal closing of the board meeting in a process.
I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second,
All in favor?
aye.
Thank you, everybody.
everyone.
Thank you.
You all. Thanks.